Chapter 4 Instant Adulthood. I've been in these chains for so long, you'll break free and I'll stand tall, and I swear this time I won't fall. Boys to Men, I will get there. Overview. Programs such as the George Jr. Republic, founded over a century ago, as well as modern programs such as Outward Bound, show the enormous power that responsibility has in helping young people to mature. When allowed to function as adults, even troubled young people quickly rise to the challenge. On the other hand, correctional boot camps and harsh military schools merely infantilize young people even more than usual. With few exceptions, they do more harm than good. Mickey, with no E, was a gang leader in one of the toughest neighborhoods in New York in the 1890s. He was as tough as they came in those days, which, admittedly, may not have been all that tough by today's standards. It's hard to say. The crimes were certainly violent at times, but they lacked the AK-47s of today's gang world. That aside, Mickey, who was probably 15 or 16 at the time, finally got caught for an unusually serious offense. After his conviction, a judge offered him a choice between a reformatory and a place called George Jr. Republic in a town in Freeville, New York, near Ithaca. He had no idea what the Junior Republic was, but a friend had coached him to pick it, and he was soon on his way. Mickey's story is told in a book called Citizens Made and Remade, an interpretation of the significance and influence of George Jr. Republics by William R. George and Lyman Beecher Stowe, Harriet Beecher Stowe's grandson. Point 1 Published in 1912, the book was a sequel to George's The Junior Republic, published 2 years earlier. Point 2 Both books document the founding and proliferation of communities that gave troubled youth a new lease on life. The concept was straightforward: take tough people off the streets and put them onto a productive track, not through medication or therapy or treatments or interventions, but by giving them a wagon load of meaningful responsibility. Mickey was quite bewildered when he arrived at the Freeport community, and the first thing he did was steal a watch from another young resident and run for the railroad station. On his way out of town, he was apprehended, not by the conventional police but by yet another resident of the Republic, and he soon found himself tried and convicted by a true jury of his peers. Even the judge, district attorney, and lawyers were teens. After being locked up for a few weeks, Mickey took a job working for a young contractor who used to be a member of his old gang in New York, and, according to the authors, Mickey gradually became industrious, clean, orderly, and law-abiding. 3 William George and the Power of Responsibility. Mickey's story may sound too good to be true, but William George was the real thing, and what eventually became a small network of miracle working communities was real too. As a young man living with his parents in New York, George was hell-bent on saving and reforming every downtrodden young man in the city, and he had plenty from which to choose. This was the 1890s, when industrialization kept millions of people working 13-hour days in gritty factories that were proliferating rapidly, and that also kept tens of thousands of people, both young and old, homeless on the streets. George convinced his parents to take in 3 or 4 homeless boys, and then he tried to create a small dairy business to help them earn their keep. When that idea failed, he decided to infiltrate and reform the street gangs. He founded a boxing club, gaining the respect of many gang members by literally pounding them into submission, and then, quite deliberately, pulled a fast one. As the new gang leader, he transformed his gang from a law-defying into a law-enforcing group called the Law and Order Gang. He offered the services of his gang to the local police sergeant to help fight crime, and he didn't stop there. As commander-in-chief, George was to advance from district to district, leaving his trusted lieutenants in command of the conquered locality, and taking with him each time a picked company of faithful followers to help capture the new territory. Point 4 One member of his gang was asked whether it had really been so bad before George reformed it. He replied, "I don't know what you'd call it. We'd smash a fellow's skull in for a nickel." 5 In other words, George had made a difference. Just how many people he saved is not clear, and the gang project eventually got off track, but George had learned something critical: giving troubled young people meaningful responsibility can turn them instantly into responsible citizens. The George Jr. Republics in 1895, with land made available by friends and family, he applied this lesson to a much more ambitious project. He created a junior version of the Big Republic, an entire community where troubled youth would, he conjectured, instantly shed their errant ways by governing that community, and, of course, themselves. By all accounts, George's project worked well, and similar republics were soon established in Connecticut, Pennsylvania, Maryland, New Jersey, and California. The original republic in Freeville exists to this day, but it's different from the original in ways that no doubt keep George turning in his grave. More about that shortly. The new communities were truly republics. Believing that self-government was one of the highest forms of responsibility, George designed them to be run entirely by their residents. The age of majority was set at 15, and people under 15 were mentored by full citizens, all between the ages of 15 and 19. A commission established in 1913 to evaluate the effectiveness of the republics found that of 1,200 young people who had left the republics, not more than 5% may at present be regarded as failures, and fully 2/3 have achieved positive success, in that they are supporting themselves and those dependent on them, and also in many instances do some definite work in the aid of other individuals. The New York Times article that reported the findings of the commission also noted that, among the more successful ex-citizens we have lawyers, civil engineers, contractors, teachers, physicians, and professional nurses, newspaper men, public office holders, mechanics, farmers, gardeners, plumbers, carpenters, and printers. 7. George himself found, as I have also observed in my teaching, by the way, that the toughest characters sometimes became the highest achievers, as time went on. Mr. George noticed that those citizens who caused the most trouble when they first came usually became the best and strongest leaders before they left. Finally, this became so marked that he announced that general badness, so far as the boys were concerned, would be regarded as a special qualification for citizenship in the Junior Republic. 8. Unfortunately, Mr. George was soon ejected from his own organization by the board of trustees he had formed to help oversee its rapid growth. At least 3 young female residents claimed that George had been sexually aggressive with them, and one claimed to have had his child. A committee investigating the various allegations concluded that his presence in the institution is clearly undesirable. 9. Abandoning the vision in spite of his sudden exit, several of the republics continued to flourish and to follow his original model until perhaps the 1970s. Actor Steve McQueen was one of the more conspicuous and grateful graduates of the California Boys Republic in the 1940s. 10. But George's ideals and decades of success were no match for the ever-advancing artificial extension of childhood. As society in general came to believe that older and older people needed the protection of adults, the republics shifted from the responsibility model to the modern treatment model. Troubled youth need to be diagnosed, medicated, treated by professionals, and so on. At some point, males and females were segregated, and in 1991, the original republic became strictly male. The current literature of the republic proudly advertises a staff-to-resident ratio of 1 to 411, so much for responsibility. Is the modern program successful? According to recent literature, since 1983, over 1,200 families have been served in the George Junior Republic Family Therapy Unit. The youths in placement who gained a recommended discharge and had active participation with their family have a 72% success rate, which is defined as not recidivating through the first year after discharge, all italics added. 12. In other words, the runaways and the dropouts, and we don't know how many of those there were, didn't fare so well, and neither did the graduates who didn't have family support. We don't know how many of those there were either. For those who met the criteria, we also don't know much beyond the first year, that is, how many turned out to be doctors, lawyers, career criminals, or murderers. As far as I can tell, modern teen treatment programs are far less effective than the old responsibility-driven programs, but it's hard to make comparisons. Here's a sad footnote on the modernization of the junior republics. While completing an early draft of this chapter, one spotted a small Associated Press story entitled, "Teens Killed Counselor, Took Truck," reporting the strangling of a 43-year-old counselor by 2 teens at a private residential school and treatment center, north of Pittsburgh, one of the remaining George Junior Republics. 13. Note that it's now a school and treatment center, not a republic. A modern law and order gang. William George's vision, the uncorrupted version, is remarkably similar to that of a more contemporary crusader, Curtis Sliva. In 1968, at age 14, Sliva founded one of the country's first neighborhood recycling centers in his parents' basement. He used the monthly income from selling sorted drums full of cans, glass, and newspapers to help neighborhood children. At 15, he was named Newspaper Boy of the Year by the New York Daily News for rescuing a family of 6 from a burning building. At 16, he was summoned to the White House to meet President Nixon in recognition of his effective community activism. 14. But Sliva is best known for founding the Guardian Angels, a group of young people trained in martial arts and sporting red berets who made it their business to protect the innocent on New York subways. This was back in 1979, when Sliva was a night manager at a McDonald's, frustrated over the growing crime problem in New York. Just as George had done a century before with his law and order gang, Sliva took tough young people and transformed them into productive citizens, mainly by giving them meaningful adult responsibilities and a positive mission. Angels chapters now exist in cities throughout North America, as well as on 3 other continents. Sliva's philosophy should now be familiar: empower people to help themselves, build self-esteem and confidence, arm them with responsibility, and you tap into the greatest source of lasting good possible. 15. Boys to Men Town, better known than the Junior Republics, is a similar endeavor called Boys Town, founded near Omaha, Nebraska, by Father Edward Joseph Flanagan in 1921. In 1912, Flanagan, a young immigrant priest from Ireland, was assigned to a small parish in O'Neill, Nebraska, where he became interested in the plight of unemployed men and, eventually, of troubled youth. In 1917, with a small donation from his friend, Henry Monsky, Flanagan rented an old Victorian mansion and, with the blessing of his church but no money, dubbed it the Home for Homeless Boys. Starting with a handful of residents, he soon outgrew the mansion and, just 4 years later, founded an extraordinary community called Boys Town 10 miles west of Omaha, initially with about 200 young residents. 16 By now, even if you've never heard of Boys Town, you probably can guess what made this community remarkable. Like the Republics, it was run almost entirely by the troubled young men who came there. It eventually had its own schools, chapel, post office, gymnasium, cottages, police force, commissioners, city council and mayor. The latter were all young men, and many of the structures in the community were built by the residents. The community was incorporated as its own town in 1936. 17 Young People in Action. Boys Town, the movie starring Spencer Tracy as reformer Father Flanagan and Mickey Rooney as tough young Whitey Marsh. This 1938 fictional film made the real Boys Town famous. The film dramatizes the founding of Boys Town, then shifts to a complex plot focusing on young Whitey. His big brother Joe, a career criminal, has begged Flanagan to try to save Whitey from his own sad fate, but Whitey is so incorrigible that the task seems impossible. When Whitey runs away from Boys Town, Pee-wee, his young companion, is struck by a car. Then Whitey is shot in the leg by his own brother during a robbery. At the end, Whitey, with help from both Joe and Flanagan, saves the day and is elected mayor of Boys Town. Unfortunately, the film made Boys Town seem so successful that contributions to the real town fell after the film's release. 20 Flanagan's philosophy was a variant of one with which you're already familiar, capture. At the end, Whitey, with help from both Joe and Flanagan, saves the day and is elected mayor of Boys Town. Unfortunately, the film made Boys Town seem so successful that contributions to the real town fell after the film's release. 20 Flanagan's philosophy was a variant of one with which you're already familiar, captured well by the old saw, "The devil makes work for idle hands." Said Flanagan, "I looked at the street boys with a sadness. Like all children, even poorly fed ones, they had too much energy. And what outlet had these poor boys for that energy? No place to play but that crowded, filthy street. Nothing to do but to get into deviltry, no proper direction. Is it any wonder they turned to wrong?" 18 He believed that placing troubled young men in a supportive, home-like environment and then giving them responsibility for running their own lives would put them on the right track. Even though many of the young people in his community had been convicted of crimes, some quite serious, and were referred by judges, Flanagan insisted that the community not be surrounded by fences or walls and that the doors not have locks on them. "I am not building a prison," he told community residents. "This is a home. You do not wall in members of your family." 19 resident reminisces, "I recently tracked down one of the few surviving residents of the original Boys Town, a former actor and veterans advocate, Bob Paradise, then in his 80s and living in Southern California. Bob was a resident of Boys Town from about 1932 to 1938. He came there at age 13, rescued from the life he had been living on the streets since his parents had been killed. During his last 4 years at Boys Town he was the chief of police. When there were problems, Paradise said, we just took care of it, like in the city. We stopped the fight, or whatever it was. We had about 10 policemen. Although there were some adults in the community, they didn't interfere with us, Paradise said, because we had to do what we were supposed to do. We never had a situation we couldn't handle. Following his graduation from Boys Town, Paradise enlisted in the U.S. Army and was sent to the Philippines, where he took law classes at the University of Manila under Army auspices. His education was interrupted when war broke out, and in 1942, he was captured by the Japanese. He was one of the survivors of the brutal Bataan Death March, in which 20,000 U.S. soldiers perished, and he remained a prisoner of war until liberated by U.S. forces in 1945. His subsequent careers, in acting, directing and legal advocacy, were all distinguished ones. Another vision lost. Boys Town was transformed over the years into a very different entity than the one Father Flanagan created. The project's success set the transformation in motion, even while Flanagan was still alive. He died in 1948. The financial success of the community allowed its administrators to hire more adult professionals to take over construction, farming, cooking and other tasks, which meant less hard work for the residents. And the changing perspectives on teens in American society, the inexorable and ever-increasing extension of childhood, led gradually to the implementation of the modern psychiatric treatment approach at Boys Town, which became co-ed in 1979. Boys Town is now a complex organization offering services in several states. Among these many programs, an intensive residential treatment center providing round-the-clock supervision in locked, secure facilities. Programs are typically run using principles of operant behavior and social learning theory. Basically, residents go to school and earn points for good behavior, and the points can then be exchanged for privileges. Medication is also employed with some clients. Point 2:1 Paradise thinks the new version doesn't hold a candle to the old. It's too commercial, he says, and it lacks the friendship and camaraderie of the old school. At some point, said Paradise, the modern version of Boys Town also stopped accepting the true incorrigibles, those referred by criminal courts for having committed serious crimes. The new treatment-oriented community also appears to lack the basic structure that Flanagan instinctively knew was necessary for producing significant life change, one based on meaningful responsibility and control over one's life. Point 2:2 Boys Towns in Italy. Another Irish priest, Monsignor John Patrick Carroll Abbing, a relief worker in Italy at the end of World War II, established another chain of George Flanagan-like communities in Italy beginning in 1945 after he noticed that young post-war street urchins in Rome seemed to be remarkably self-sufficient. The first was started near the town of Civitavecchia, 45 miles north of Rome, and other Italian boys' towns. The first was initially called the Shoeshine Boys Hotel, were later created in Palermo, Lucca, Pozzuoli, Chieti, Rome and elsewhere. Eventually, separate girls' towns were established. All were governed by the young residents, generally from 10 to 20 years old, based on Carroll Abbing's belief, according to community materials, that young people will react enthusiastically to authentic challenge that fulfills their humanity. 23 Italy has so far avoided the mental health and treatment models that dominate here, and teens there are still often considered to be young adults. Not only do all of the Italian boys and girls towns still exist, they are all still run largely according to Carroll Abbing's original design. The downside of treatment. Given my background in psychology, you might be surprised by the skepticism I'm expressing about the treatment approach to teen problems. In fact, I earned my doctorate working with the eminent behavioral psychologist, B.F. Skinner, arguably the key person behind modern social learning interventions. Although these interventions are powerful in changing behavior, especially in the short term, I've never been convinced that they actually change people in any significant sense, at least not when we're dealing with relatively normal young people and adults. I helped train staff and consulted on cases at a variety of institutions for many years, and it was generally my impression that the residents were just going along with the programs, complying with instructions and requests mainly to avoid penalties, lying in wait for the opportunity to leave the facility. Many were bleary-eyed from too much medication, few had meaningful relationships with other residents. Why bother, when people come and go frequently and it's virtually impossible to keep in touch? And meaningful relationships with staff were strictly forbidden. Skinner himself long extolled the virtues of natural contingencies, of reinforcement and punishment over the contrived contingencies one finds in treatment programs. 24 But many of Skinner's followers have missed this point. The natural consequences of behavior, the warm and sincere embrace of a dear friend one has helped, the anger of someone one has offended, the sight of crops one has planted with one's own hands, are far more impactful than the insincere praise and M&M-like points and tokens of a B-Mod program. The brilliance of the George and Flanagan-style communities lay, I believe, in the sublime power of the natural contingencies those communities provided. Growing up in the woods, Julian, my eldest son, had some rough teen years. I'm sure I don't know a fraction of what actually happened, because I was raising Justin, the easy one, while my ex-wife was struggling with Julian. When he was 14, his mom sent him off on a $3,000 trip to the woods for a few weeks to try to straighten him out. As Julian remembers it, Mom said it was either military school or 24 days on Hurricane Island. It was an easy choice. We had to carry all of our supplies for 3 weeks on our backs, so our packs weighed upwards of 60 pounds. Our 2 counselors left us alone much of the time to get us to try to resolve our own disputes and figure out how the map worked. By the end of the first week, my mosquito bites had melded into one continuous bite. The first week or so was all hiking through woods and trails, the second week was almost entirely canoeing, and the final 9 days was spent hiking up hills and mountains. About midway through the trip we were required to separate and spend a day and a night alone in the woods. One day was set aside for whitewater rafting, a first for most of us. It was incredible. I remember seeing a bear cub sliding down a tree as it tried to flee from us. The most spiritual moment for me was when we finally reached the top of our first mountain. I'll never forget the awesome sight of the water and forests far beneath us. I took a peaceful nap by a cliff. At the end of the trip, everyone who had attended Outward Bound, there were many groups, was expected to run an 11-mile marathon. The night before the race I ate something that made me sick and I was up until the next morning throwing up. I wasn't able to race with the group, so the counselors insisted that I make the run myself the next morning. I left the trailing counselor in the dust and realized by the end of the 11 miles, which was quite easy for me, that I was now in the best shape of my life. Young people in action navigating the teen years in 1858, on a voyage around Cape Horn, 19-year-old Mary Patton's husband, the captain of a large clipper ship, fell ill. The first mate was in irons for insubordination, the second mate was ignorant of navigation. Mrs. Patton had made herself mistress of the art of navigation during a previous voyage. She took command, and for 52 days she navigated the ship of 1,800 tons, tending her husband the while, and took both safely into San Francisco. Samuel Eliot Morison, The Maritime History of Massachusetts. Julian was one of many thousands of young people who are, in a sense, abandoned in the woods each year by an innovative organization called Outward Bound, which came into being, indirectly, anyway, because of another young man named Julian more than 60 years ago. Origins of Outward Bound. In 1941, Julian Holt was a student at a private school in Wales, UK, called the Gordonston School, founded and directed by Kurt Hahn, a German Jewish genius who had originally founded the school in Germany in 1920 but later fled to England to escape persecution by the Nazis. 25 Hahn's teaching philosophy was a radical departure from the authoritarian style of the German schools of his day. Hahn believed that he could build character in young people by giving them real responsibilities, putting them on their honor, encouraging them to provide service to the community, providing only minimal supervision, and subjecting them to vigorous exercise. He was staunchly opposed to imposing education on people who weren't ready to learn, which he compared with pouring into a jug and never looking to see whether the lid is off. 26 Julian's father, the English shipping magnate Sir Lawrence Holt, was a major contributor to the school and a strong supporter of Hahn's. With England at war against Germany, Holt was deeply concerned about the lack of physical and emotional toughness in British Navy cadets. Hahn suggested that they create an offshoot of Gordonston to build a new generation of tough, independent British seamen. The new program, at first called the Aberdovi Sailing School, later Outward Bound, was launched in 1941 with 8 students from the Gordonston School, 8 workers from Holt's shipping company, and 8 young cadets from a British naval ship, the HMS Conway. Hahn had come to believe that 2 or 3 week programs, mainly for young soldiers and firefighters, had virtually no long-term effects on performance and that it took at least 28 days to toughen someone up long-term. 27 Thus began the system that is still used widely today in outward bound programs around the world. 28, or, today, sometimes 24, days of rigorous physical training, individual and team challenges, and outdoor adventures. Training toughness and independence. In the original program, young people learned to throw a javelin, discus and shot put, to do long and high jumps, to run and sprint and, above all, to climb and walk long distances in the rugged Welsh hills. 28 According to Renata Wilson, author of Inside Outward Bound, towards the end of the 28 days even the weediest were sent on cross-country hikes of up to 30 miles, climbing a couple of peaks on the way. Although some expressed concern initially that the program would strain the students, Hahn's training methods demonstrated that every youngster could improve his athletic performance, no matter how inexperienced he was in a sport, and that he would not be harmed by the effort. 29 Hahn and Holt's program also included rigorous training on and above the water, because naval fortitude was the primary goal: rowing, sailing, climbing nets, running obstacle courses, climbing rope ladders, crossing ropes strung between trees, climbing smooth walls that approximated the sides of ships, and getting the boys to clamber over the rigging of a local sailing ship. The ropes course, according to Wilson, became one of the features built into every outward bound school. 30 participants were organized into watches of 12 individuals, another custom that is maintained to this day, and within each watch, a captain and other officials were elected by the watch members. Individual responsibility was stressed throughout the program. Among other things, participants kept a record of their own progress in athletics, seamanship and land expeditions, and were put on their honor not to cheat. 31 The program was said to be an immediate success. Aberdovi toughened participants' bodies and armed them against the enemies within: fear, defeatism, apathy, selfishness. 32 It continued to train young cadets and potential cadets until the war's end in 1945. After the war, similar outward bound schools were established in Ullswater, near the original school, and Holne Park in Devon, and an all-female version was founded in Ronair, a few miles from Aberdovi. The British Army founded 2 additional outward bound schools in Wales and Norway. In the early 1950s, Joshua Milner III, one of the teachers at the Gordonston School, founded the Outward Bound movement in the United States, which now consists of a series of wilderness schools and urban centers throughout the country. In addition, more than 1,000 institutions of various sorts in the U.S., universities, government agencies and so on, use outward-bound methodology to train their constituents. 3 For young people in action, leaving drugs behind. Can a wilderness experience help a young person kick drugs? According to a 1991 report in the Journal of Adolescent Chemical Dependency, the answer is yes. Jeff, one of the subjects in the study, was a 16-year-old high school student with a long history of drug abuse: cocaine, marijuana, alcohol and more, 5 times a week. He said drugs were his way of finding freedom, escape from his father's controlling ways. A treatment program at the Beach Hill Hospital in New Hampshire included 22 days in an outward-bound wilderness school. Jeff started out in tears because his pack was too heavy and ended up crying with relief and gratitude because he had grown so much in the wild. 3 months later, Jeff was still sober. About 3/4 of the young people in the program appeared to reap similar benefits. 33 Several of Outward Bound's programs are specifically designed to try to get troubled teens back on track. Intercept, for example, an expedition experience, claims to help young people navigate through treacherous water. Outward Bound bills the program as an early intervention for teens who may have started down a self-destructive path but who have not yet burned any vital bridges. 35 To put this another way, the organization is not looking for convicted criminals, but, according to Wilson, about 5% of the participants in programs like this are ordered to attend by correctional services or a benevolent foundation. 36 How Outward Bound helps, but does it work? What effects, if any, does a challenging program emphasizing individual responsibility have on teens? Dozens of research studies have been conducted since the 1960s to address the question, and the results are fairly clear. A study of 60 delinquents published in 1969, for example, found that participation in Outward Bound produced more favorable social attitudes and evaluation of feelings. 37 According to the authors, a young man should not just be told that he is capable of more than he thinks he can do, but rather a set of circumstances must be devised in which he demonstrates such competence to himself. 38 A Boston University study conducted in 1972 with non-delinquent individuals in their late teens found that the Outward Bound experience produced positive changes in the participants' self-concept, roughly, their assessment of their own abilities and self-worth. The gains declined when the teens returned to their home environments. 39 A 1982 study by Alan Wright of Pennsylvania State University with juvenile delinquents found that Outward Bound produced positive changes in self-esteem, an assessment of self-worth, self-efficacy, an assessment of one's ability to perform in various ways, and other measures of cognitive functioning. 40 A 1981 review of 73 studies of Outward Bound type programs by Leslie Burton of Rutgers sums up the findings as follows. In general, the results indicate that Outward Bound type programs do have a positive impact upon self-perceptions such as self-concept, locus of control, self-assertion and personality. Actual behavior such as grade point average, observed behavior, school functioning and absenteeism does not undergo much significant change as a result of Outward Bound type programs. One notable exception is recidivism, which is markedly reduced in the methodologically select studies. 41 Subsequent studies confirm these general conclusions, and a recent study by Scott Husted of the University of Nebraska-Lincoln even finds that Outward Bound positively influences academic achievement in at-risk teens. 42 I've been unable to find a single study that suggests that Outward Bound produces any negative effects, physical, emotional, cognitive or behavioral. Challenge and responsibility, it seems, are good medicine. Limitations of Outward Bound. Unfortunately, Outward Bound is only a halfway measure. It gives people real challenges and real responsibilities, but not in the real world. It necessarily runs into a problem psychologists call transfer of training. What people learn in one environment doesn't necessarily transfer to other environments, especially when those other environments place very different demands on the learners. When the original Outward Bound was toughening up people to enter the Navy, it subsequently sent them to the Navy. When troubled young people are toughened up in a modern Outward Bound program, they're subsequently sent back to the streets from which they came, to a world that treats them like helpless children. Fortunately, the transfer problem is irrelevant to the main question I'm exploring in this volume. I'm not asking whether a 4-week experience can produce a permanent or profound effect on behavior, but rather whether young people are capable of behaving responsibly. The Outward Bound studies remind us that Hahn was right. When you give young people a significant amount of responsibility, in this case, by subjecting them to enormous challenges in the wilderness, they rise to those challenges. As a bonus, many are changed in positive and significant ways that carry over to some extent in the real world. At the very least, they begin to view themselves as more effective, more capable people, even though home and school environments continue to tell them that they are inherently irresponsible and incompetent. Young People in Action. Presidential President George Washington, first President of the United States, completed his education in his early teens. At 16, he went to work for Lord Thomas Fairfax, surveying land in the Shenandoah Valley of Virginia. He spent part of his earnings on land purchases and by 21, had 1,500 acres of his own. Outward Bound is the largest, oldest and best known of a number of adventure-based programs that expose people, young and old, to challenging and sometimes life-changing experiences. For young participants, Outward Bound type adventures provide, in many cases, the first opportunity they've ever had to function as tough, self-reliant individuals. The natural world used to provide those opportunities early in life, but now, it seems, we must pay large sums between $4,000 and $60,000 at this writing to professionals to give our offspring a taste of real responsibility. Is this the best we can do? Are there other ways to help young people grow up? Does military school work? My son chose Outward Bound over the dreaded military school. Just what is military school these days, and what effect, if any, does it have on young people? Bear in mind that modern high school level military schools or their close relatives, correctional boot camps, aren't real military operations. Real military academies and boot camps serve a real purpose, to condition young soldiers, both physically and mentally, to kill real enemies and follow the orders of superiors. See Chapter 9. Real soldiers are not treated like children. Quite the contrary, they're taught to use lethal weapons for legitimate, or at least government-sanctioned, purposes. There are obvious reasons for real military training camps to exist and for the instructors at those camps to impose rigorous training regimens on new soldiers. As we look at correctional boot camps and military schools for young people, ask yourself whether they have the legitimacy of real military programs. If they don't, expect problems. Correctional boot camps in the early 1980s, Georgia, Louisiana and Oklahoma pioneered harsh, military-style boot camps as a way of dealing with rising crime rates and extreme overcrowding in state prisons. 43 Here's how a 1995 article described the entry of teen offenders into a camp in Manatee, Florida. All is quiet at the Manatee, FLA, Sheriff's Boot Camp as a vanload of teenaged lawbreakers slowly rolls up the drive to a stop. Seconds pass. Suddenly, a shrill whistle shatters the silence. A swarm of sheriff's deputies appears from nowhere. Beating their fists on the van, a dozen officers in dark glasses and drill sergeant hats scream orders at the startled youths inside. The camp's newest recruits are hauled out of the van, searched and patted down, subjected to a head shaving. And it all happens in double time, with high-decibel deputies barking commands just inches from the young toughs' faces. I was scared senseless, recalls a 17-year-old recruit, whose conviction for battery, burglary and car theft brought him a 4-month sentence at the Florida camp. 44 Imagine you're one of the inductees. How would you react to the harshness of your reception? How would you react to the day-by-day abuse you suffer at the hands of the officers? Bearing in mind that you are not being prepared to fight a war, or even to get a challenging job, in other words, that there's no easy way to excuse the objectionable behavior of your oppressors, how would you account for the cruelty to which you are being subjected? Would your respect for authority increase, or would you feel more contempt for authority after such an experience? Early reports on the correctional boot camps, such as an article about the Georgia camps that appeared in Life magazine in 1988, were encouraging. After prison, 70% avoid going back. After boot camp, 80% of the young men stay out of trouble. To all appearances, these boot camps seem to be a plausible way to reduce the socially and economically disastrous overcrowding that 37 states are under court order to alleviate. 45 The Ford Foundation provided $100,000 to support the boot camp program, and by the late 1980s, at least 15 states were running or developing similar programs. The point of such programs, according to the Life article, was to penetrate thick young adult skulls before it's too late. 46 Truett Goodwin, identified in the article as a warden in the Georgia boot camp at Forsyth, explained the guiding philosophy with the well-tuned sensitivity of a seasoned educator. You have to hit a mule between the eyes with a 2x4 to get his attention. 47 Abuse and sadism. Tough correctional boot camps need tough correctional employees. As one might expect, these sometimes turn out to be people who enjoy shouting at and punishing young people all day. By the mid-1990s, troubling reports began to appear about abuse and sadism at various camps. In 1998, 5 staff members at a boot camp in Oracle, Arizona, the Arizona Boys Ranch, were indicted in connection with the death of a 16-year-old resident. One of those indicted was the camp nurse, to whom the young man had been sent repeatedly with complaints of chest pains and difficulty breathing. The nurse kept sending him back to the regular staff, who continued to subject him to strenuous exercises. The coroner's report noted that he died of empyema, a condition involving a buildup of fluids in the chest cavity, in his case more than 2.5 quarts of pus. He was also suffering from chronic bronchitis, pneumonia, and strep and staph infections, and his body was covered with cuts and bruises, 71 in all. 48 Eventually, the Arizona Boys Ranch was denied a license to operate, and 17 of its former employees were listed in the Arizona Child Abuser Directory. Other deaths and abuses at boot camps have also come to light over the years. As a result, Arizona, Florida, Maryland, North Dakota, Georgia, and Colorado have now shut down their state-run boot camps, and California is scaling back. 49 In 2004, Louisiana shut down Tallulah, its toughest juvenile prison, because of a 10-year history of riots, beatings, and rapes both by staff and other inmates, and because of a recidivism rate of about 60%. 50 The abuse aside, do boot camps work? In a 1995 report in Corrections Today, Deborah Sharp argues that the scared, senseless approach to corrections with teens produces only short-term, surface results. Inmates generally toe the line only as long as the taskmasters are at hand. 51 A 2000 report by the Institute on Crime, Justice and Corrections at George Washington University, reviewing the effectiveness of 8 boot camps around the country, concluded, although many of the programs have been well administered and popular with public officials, they have not demonstrated a significant impact on recidivism, prisoner jail crowding, or costs, which have been the 3 core goals of boot camps. The future of boot camps is not promising. 52 Of special note, a State of the Science panel of experts assembled in 2004 by the National Institutes of Health drew a similar conclusion. Programs that seek to prevent violence through fear and tough treatment appear ineffective. 53 In a rational world, such reports should wrap things up, but they haven't. Whereas many state-run boot camps have been closed and some private ones shut down by authorities, desperate parents are still scouring the internet for magical fixes for their unruly teens, and private companies are only too happy to make promises. As journalist Maya Shalovitz documents in her recent book, Help at Any Cost, How the Troubled Teen Industry Cons Parents and Hurts Kids, not only are such companies flourishing, when they get into trouble, they often simply change their names or locations and keep right on going, often employing the same staff members. 54 A number of young people who were harmed by boot camps, along with their parents, have now established websites and organizations to call attention to the dark side of what they call the Gulag schools. See Appendix 6 for a partial list. Boot camps that are not entirely consumed with breaking the inmates fare better. Sharp notes that programs that include specific types of real-world training in problem-solving skills, for example, or that encourage legitimate, meaningful relationships between inmates and staff produce better results than those based merely around military discipline. The 2004 NIH panel agrees, concluding that intensive programs that aim at developing skills and competencies can work. 55 In one such program, the McNeil Island Work Ethic Camp in Washington State, the relationship between inmates and their supervisors, says Sharp, is closer to the link between employee and employer than between military grunt and drill instructor. Inmates have a choice of jobs, and the work is supplemented by classes on anger management, victim awareness and life planning. 56 57 Military schools. High school level military schools used to number in the hundreds in the United States, but there are now fewer than 50, and many are struggling to stay open. 58 Many of the studies of the effectiveness of secondary military schools were conducted around World War II. There seems to be relatively little interest today. An exception is a study by Lee Tarrant of Kansas State University, conducted in 1982, which found improvements in leadership skills among students at 5 private military schools in Kansas and Missouri. Unfortunately, Tarrant's study also found that consideration for others decreased significantly among military school students in comparison with students in regular public schools. 59 A study conducted by John Hoare in 1981 found that military rank and military excellence among students at secondary military schools were poor predictors of the moral reasoning ability of those students, also a discouraging finding. 60 Young People in Action Discipline by the Sea. Founded in 1910, the Army and Navy Academy in Carlsbad, California, just north of San Diego, supplements the strict military component of its program with an excellent mix of character-building experiences. It also has the advantage of being located on the cliffs overlooking the Pacific Ocean, with surfing beaches located nearby. The beauty of this program is that the main M&M cadets get for showing they can handle responsibility is more responsibility, higher ranks, and more respect from, control over, and responsibility for other cadets. The general claim, when the cadets are given this power and responsibility, appropriately monitored, they usually flourish as diligent leaders. Selected cadets also serve as peer mediators, who handle situations involving homesickness, getting along with roommates, respecting authority, following and leading. Unfortunately, as I found with similar schools, the ANA doesn't seem to have any data at hand on the effectiveness of its program. The U.S. General Accounting Office, responding to a Senate request in 1993, reported that the handful of secondary-level military schools operated directly by the Army, Navy and Air Force were equal to or superior to private preparatory schools, but the GAL's report also stated that this conclusion was not based on any new research or analysis. 61. It also mentioned that the attrition rate at the Army's high school was as high as 40%, a figure suggesting major flaws either with the school or with the admissions process. Generally, one finds the same pattern in military schools that we saw with the boot camps. Schools focusing exclusively on military discipline tend to produce short-term behavioral effects and, sometimes, a long-term dislike for authority, whereas schools that give young people meaningful training and real responsibility produce better outcomes. Point 62. The meaningfulness of the experience is key. An experience has meaning when we believe it is connected to people or things we really care about, our immediate family, for example, or our careers or country. That's one of the reasons real military schools such as the United States Military Academy at West Point produce outstanding results. The people entering such academies, which are at the college level, are headed toward officer-level careers in the military. Admission is highly competitive, and the training makes sense. One learns to follow orders, lead others, work in teams, handle weapons, and so on, so that one can advance one's military career and, if necessary, defend one's country. Cadets are given significant responsibilities related to real-world challenges, and the most extreme form of individual accountability, the honor system, is enforced. Although humiliation has often been a part of the training regimen at West Point, at least for entering cadets, in no sense are West Point cadets treated like children. They are taught, almost from day one, to become strong leaders, not helpless followers, and the system works well. West Point graduates often have exemplary careers both in and out of the military. In the class of 1915 alone, 59 of the 164 graduates became generals, earning a total of 111 stars, and Ulysses S. Grant, Robert E. Lee, John J. Pershing, Dwight D. Eisenhower, George S. Patton, Douglas MacArthur, and many other notables were West Point graduates, among them 3 Heisman Trophy recipients and 18 astronauts. 63 Placing enormous demands on young people, at least demands that they find meaningful, seems not only to keep them out of trouble but, in many cases, to bring out the very best in them. But why? The Power of Responsibility. 2 theories. In 1971, on the campus of Stanford University, social psychologist Philip Zimbardo set in motion one of the most famous social science studies of the 20th century, the Stanford Prison Experiment. 24 college students were assigned randomly to one of 2 groups, guards or prisoners, and then asked to play those roles in rooms renovated to resemble prison cells. Some of the guards soon became so abusive and some of the prisoners so distressed that Zimbardo had to stop the experiment after a mere 6 days. 64 The experiment is said to show the enormous power that roles play in our lives, a power so great that it can quickly turn perfectly decent, intelligent college students into insensitive tyrants. Because Zimbardo himself served as the prison superintendent and because he failed to conduct any controls, such as issuing orders for participants to be extra nice to each other, it's possible that the abuse he witnessed was due entirely to experimenter expectations, in other words, that students were performing the way they did in order to please their professor. This issue aside, roles are indeed very powerful, just as Zimbardo said they were. Young people in action. Instant adulthood. Scottish style. Rory Lord is a 16-year-old from Perth, Scotland, who wasn't well suited for school. "I couldn't be bothered listening," he said. Before he got into any serious trouble, he found himself whisked away from the classroom and apprenticed full-time to Mick McManaman, a window technician. Rory is one of hundreds of young men and women in Scotland who have, through a program called Working Right, been successfully rescued from risky activities, including crime and gang involvement, and paired with people in a variety of trades. The success rate so far is about 80%. The program works, says founder Sandy Campbell, because it provides a natural way to bring teenagers into the world of adults. Rory's 6-month trial period started out a bit rocky but ultimately led to a 3-year contract with a window company. 65 The very first day someone becomes a teacher or a police officer or a cashier or a dad, one behaves, and even feels, very much like the character one is supposed to play. It's like magic. I remember the first time I pushed baby Julian down the street in a stroller. People were approaching from the other direction, and I suddenly had a strong urge to push them aside to clear the way. Where did that urge come from, I wondered. Hormones. Not likely. I was now a father, and I was doing what I believed fathers were supposed to do, namely, protecting my child. I was playing a role, somewhat the way an actor does in a play, except that actors are motivated by money and applause, whereas I was motivated by reality, by what B.F. Skinner called natural contingencies of reinforcement and punishment. What happens when you put a young person into the role of adult? And no, I'm not talking about shouting, "Grow up," at your 15-year-old. I'm talking about really putting someone into that role, just as I was really put into the role of dad. The answer is that the teen acts and even feels like an adult. That's why very young soldiers, or young people who suddenly find themselves responsible for younger siblings or disabled parents, or young people who no longer have access to parents or other authority figures, or young people told by Father Flanagan to set up their own government, mature so quickly. When thrust into adult roles, they act and feel like adults. Even pre-teens can do this, but with teens the transformation is sometimes quite radical because they are equipped, both mentally and physically, to be adults. Role-playing theory. Under this theory, let's call it the role-playing theory of adulthood, do young people actually become adults? For a question of such Talmudic proportions, let's consult the Talmud. The ancient rabbis tell the tale of a selfish man who is convinced by a rabbi to do one good deed for his family or the community every week. Over the years, these deeds accumulate, and on his gravestone the man is remembered for his kindness and generosity. But was this unpleasant fellow really kind and generous, or was he just following orders? Some of the sages say yes, the generosity was real, and others say no, the man was a fake. It's a split decision. So perhaps young people playing adult roles are really adults, and perhaps not. By the same logic, perhaps adults playing adult roles are really adults, and perhaps not. It depends how willing you are to distinguish between someone's actions and someone's hypothetical self. I'm comfortable calling people who teach teachers and people who protect the public and carry badges police officers, no matter what they are really like in the dark confines of their souls. I'm also comfortable calling young people who behave like adults, adults. It makes no sense to me to hesitate to call someone an adult simply because of his or her age or appearance. I think most people would agree that we want adulthood to refer to a set of abilities, not to someone's height or numerical age. More about this in Chapter 6. Restoration theory. According to role-playing theory, young people given adult responsibilities become adults in some sense because of the power of roles. But there might be another, more intriguing, reason responsibility is life-changing for our young. Soon after puberty, many or most young people are fully equipped to function as adults. When we infantilize them, we interfere with normal development. Giving young people meaningful responsibilities might simply be a way of restoring normal functioning. Under this theory, which I'll call our restoration theory of adulthood, artificially extending childhood holds people back, and it might even stunt growth permanently, a possibility I'll explore to some extent in Chapters 7 and 9. Giving young people adult responsibilities restores the child-adult continuum that Jean Lidloff spoke about and thereby allows development to get back on track. The false and decaying skin of the old child is shed, and the hidden adult emerges. Wanting adulthood now, whatever the reasons for its effectiveness, responsibility plays an enormous role in shaping character, as programs such as the original Junior Republic or the modern version of Outward Bound remind us. Such programs also remind us of the importance of preserving the child-adult continuum. Where modern society has destroyed that continuum, it may be possible, by providing young people with certain training and experiences, to rebuild the continuum quickly and thus to create a kind of instant adulthood. But many young people today aren't willing to wait. They want adulthood now, and they often find their own ways to achieve it. There are at least 3 ways a young person can achieve adulthood instantly in our society without a shred of assistance from adults. From a certain moment on, everyone around that young person will treat him or her with entirely different expectations. From that moment forward, he or she will behave radically differently, rising in varying degrees to the challenges of real adulthood. 3 relatively simple acts shout to society, in tones that cannot be ignored, "I am an adult, damn it. And you will treat me that way from now on." These acts are getting married, having a baby, and committing a serious crime. I'll turn to crime and pregnancy in the next chapter, and I'll take a surprising look at young spouses in Chapter 8 and at young mothers in Chapter 11. Q. Are all teens capable of taking on the responsibilities and handling the authority that adults have? A. No, but many adults also handle responsibility and authority poorly. They drink before they drive, abuse drugs, overeat, cheat on their taxes, and so on. A better question would be, are all teens incapable of acting like adults? The answer to that question is also no. Yet we hold back all teens based strictly on a superficial characteristic, age. We've learned not to make this mistake with the elderly. Now we need to take a fresh look at teens, evaluating them based on their individual abilities. Chapter 5. Storm and Stress. I wanna thank you, Mom. I wanna thank you,